Okay, good afternoon, colleagues. Hope you're all keeping well. So today we're going to look at the second session. My colleague Roisin covered a session on Canvas for assessment. So this is the second assessment one today, looking at the Zoom application. Now I'm going to keep it quite kind of theoretical, abstract here. We're not going to go into Zoom because it really is more about um, I suppose, identifying the type of assessment that you can do in Zoom. And at this stage, any of the how-tos are really covered by all of our other sessions if you think about the different elements that I'm going to cover. So um, I can refer you on to any specific technical demonstrations after this session or from this session if you like. But today we're just going to maybe explore what kind of assessment we can achieve using Zoom. So session outline, as with other sessions, we're going to keep this to around the 30-minute mark, just under it, I'd say. And we're going to look at a few key things. So we're going to look at some assessment scenarios using Zoom. So I suppose to date, many of us have been using, particularly the new people to Zoom have been using it really primarily for live delivery. And that would be delivering a live class, as we know, through the Zoom integration in Canvas, where you have the benefits of enrollment and all of that stuff from Canvas. So today we're kind of thinking, maybe just rethinking the use of Zoom and looking at the different functions that Zoom provides us to run formative or summative assessment activities. So I'm just going to talk briefly about some assessment scenarios. Now, not all of them, because I'm sure even any of you guys will come up with really neat ways of doing assessment in this live environment. And I suppose it's beyond the scope of this session to cover all of them, but I can kind of cover the fundamentals there today and just talk about what we've had experience with in the online programs. We're also going to look specifically at presentations because that really is one of the really useful assessment activities that you can kind of carry out without a huge amount of effort, with a bit of structure, a bit of pre-planning, but really, really effective in an online environment like Zoom, because you can facilitate online presentations by students, have them recorded and assess them accordingly as well then. We're also going to look at some power tips for presentations in Zoom. So again, really focusing on the presentation aspect of things there. I'm just going to talk about a few tips that'll help you along the way. Again, from our experience over the last 4 to 5 years, really using Zoom for the online programs in CIT. So as always, if you want to ask any questions, please maybe use the Q&A, or if you're on YouTube, my colleague Roisin is kindly managing that as well. So if you have any questions, you can relay them, and I'm kind of keeping an eye on there as well. So the first thing I want to talk about is maybe this diagram here, and this you might be familiar with from one of Garrod's initial sort of presentations on all of the sorts of the e-learning infrastructure options, and I suppose the core Canvas features and how all of that stuff relates to the everyday activities in CIT, particularly in this remote teaching and learning period. So I suppose for today, really, we'd be talking mainly about Zoom. But Zoom, handily enough, will actually, as a live communication tool, kind of almost like transcends this line here into the asynchronous as well. We'll talk about that in a minute, but I guess what I'm kind of trying to get at here is there's a lot of live communication tools that aren't even mentioned in here, that actually work quite well in Zoom as shares for assessment. And I'll talk about a few of those options later on, but they'd be kind of third-party tools, or they could be other tools that we have available to us within these diagrams. But if you think about it, these quadrants don't necessarily just always contain or restrict those applications. Sometimes they can move into others. If you think about it, we can easily do a Zoom session demonstrating stuff that we're doing in Canvas. We can use rubrics alongside something like Zoom to assess material. We could look at other activities here as being things that we could share in Zoom. So I suppose what I'm getting at is there's a lot of stuff that you can share from the Zoom application that maybe kind of extends out what you maybe think of from just maybe using PowerPoint presentations and software shares. So we'll talk a small bit about that in a minute. Really, I suppose as we think about assessment, we can think about them in two primary categories, and these would be formative assessment activities and summative assessment activities. So the formative being the stuff that isn't typically graded but really contributes to the overall learning and quantum of work that the students do in a module, and contribute into the stuff that you do in the summative assessment column on the right hand side. The summative is typically graded then and contributes to their overall mark. I'm going to talk to you a small bit initially about formative assessment activities because they are quite effective in something like Zoom, where you can, with a bit of structure and a bit of guidance for the students, you can provide really rich learning activities. On the right hand column, then I'll talk to you mainly there about presentations, but obviously that can look at things like demonstrations, which aren't too far away from presentations, obviously, but you can think about software demonstrations and so on, and also the idea of doing things like interviews. So the first thing I'm going to just talk about briefly is formative assessment examples. So if you think of formative assessment, really Zoom is really, really powerful in this, in its own right, for supporting these kind of formative activities. So if you think of something like a case study, for example, you could spend your class working through a case study with your students. Consider providing them maybe with the case study to familiarize with themselves with it beforehand, and then maybe slowly build up a case to revealing new information through the session. Likewise, for things like group work, we've all learned so far that breakout rooms are a great way of splitting students up into their own rooms to collaborate. You could think of roaming between different rooms from the main room, inviting students to return back in there and have questions about group tasks that you might set up. And you might be asking students also to discuss reading or work through a problem or start work on a group assessment task. And sometimes those group assessment tasks will be graded, sometimes they're ungraded, but that whole breakout rooms function in terms of either formative or maybe summative activities is really, really powerful as well. What you can also do is, as we've learned, you can invite guest speakers, and those guest speakers could be within CIT. There could be people, there could be CIT staff, or we could invite external speakers. And we've learned from previous sessions that we can invite a guest speaker by choosing an authentication option in scheduling, when we're scheduling in Canvas, that just puts a password on it, on the session, for that person, and then they can come in and all they need is a Zoom account to contribute. That's really powerful if you want to ask students to reflect on that, maybe in something like a graded discussion in Canvas. So, as an activity, you could invite someone in to do a guest speaker slot, have it maybe for half an hour, 40 minutes, and then maybe ask the students some key questions in something like Canvas. That could be framed in a thread in a discussion. And as we have learned as well, you can set up graded discussions in Canvas, and those may contribute then to an overall mark and provide a continuous assessment mechanism as well in Canvas or in the module. So that's a really nice way of getting, the students to reflect rather than it just being, a guest speaker coming in and maybe not having a lot of evidence afterwards that the students have reflected as such. Now, in those guest speaker sessions, obviously you can ask the students to use the chat or to use the mic if they want to ask questions. But I think the power of things like guest speakers is really, it is something that's quite effective, and with a small bit of planning can work quite well. The other thing you can do is you can ask students to work collaboratively on a document. So this is maybe the idea of looking at something in like this diagram here and thinking of Zoom not only as a tool that's in the live area, but maybe transcends into something like the asynchronous communication and collaboration area. So for instance, if you think of something like Google Documents, Google Docs, which is sort of a tool that would maybe happen or be used in this area, but also here because you have live functions in Google Docs. It could also be something in Microsoft 365 where you have a Word document that people can collaborate on live. And simply then in your live session, what you'd be doing is you'd be doing a share of that in your Zoom session and have students working collaboratively on that document. If you think about breakout rooms, you could use a collaborative document in one of those as well. And again, I suppose the idea here is that you're not just focusing solely on, sharing a document or a PowerPoint slide deck or something like that. What you can do is you can flip it around into something that has its own life and you can see people contributing to that live. Other things you could do is you could look at running a student debate. So maybe have students form an argument around some sort of a divisive topic in your subject or your module. And you can allow time for the students to work in groups before they take turns maybe to persuade the class of their position in that debate. So, lots of stuff that you can do to creatively use some of those features in Zoom, particularly if you kind of throw it back on the student and provide them with some sort of guidance or structure on same. So, on guidance and structure, I think maybe just a sample class structure might be useful in terms of formative assessment. Now, this doesn't have to be necessarily just about formative assessment. It could be summative as well. But I just wanted to maybe show you what that, a structure for something like this might look like. So I think it's always good to plan these things out, and that can be as simple as just having a Word document that you have printed out for yourself. And if you don't have access to a printer, maybe you just use Word open on another screen or on your phone. And it's useful to have something just to work from as a structure for your class. And particularly when you're looking at trying to work in assessment activities into that class. So here's an example, and this is just an example where you could maybe define the period of an hour roughly into little segments where you kind of identify what you're going to do with the class. So general chat and icebreaker at the beginning is a 5-minute activity here. 2 minutes where you can provide an outline of the class. 10 minutes where you can do a short presentation with slides around that particular subject. Another 3 minutes to do a live poll. So we've talked about live polls in Zoom, and if you don't, if you're not familiar with them, we can refer you on to some guides, all in our help center really, that cover this and the likes of breakout rooms as well. And the idea of doing a live poll is that's almost like a little form of formative assessment in itself. It also helps you to kind of pose a question and get some feedback from the learners in a very immediate way as well. The activity 5 here, we have 5 minutes, so that's just asking for some maybe justifications on their answers. So expanding it just from being a sort of a two-dimensional poll where you get a response to asking the students to maybe elaborate on those responses and talk about the justification for their response. So you not only get maybe a live indication as to the numbers, of students choosing a particular answer, but you then ask them maybe to justify their response in here. The other thing then is splitting into breakout rooms, which we've talked about. So maybe at this point for 15 minutes, you could ask them to go out into groups and discuss at the topic that you're talking about. Maybe provide them with some sort of a template of sorts. That's really useful, I think, from a student's point of view, to give them structure again. And that's the idea of even providing something like a Google Doc or something like that, which is at a shared link, and the students can use that. Obviously, that as well can be just a Word document that you have available in Canvas or a PDF or something like that. But I think providing structure to the students is really important in this context. Then if we kind of look on to the other activities, you could think of a 10-minute activity where you kind of look at the main group coming back into the main session, and then asking one student from each group to share their summary and to share their screen as well. And we'll talk maybe just slightly about the presentation aspect in a minute, but that's where presentation would enter into the fore really, and your students can use their microphones, they can share their screen, provided you give them the correct permissions. So you'll all recall, if you've been to the training, if you haven't, no problem. All of it is recorded and available on our site and on YouTube. But you can, through the security tab in Zoom, you can allow students to have the ability to share their screen or to use their microphones. And by default, as we know, all of them are muted in a Zoom session. So you can, provided you give them the control in that security tab, the students can then come back in and they can do a kind of a nominated presentation from each group. I think that's really, really useful as well. Each group gets the benefit of seeing each other's presentations. There's peer learning there, and everyone is getting to use those rich tools that are available in Canva or in Zoom. So just to note as well, if you're in the breakout rooms, you don't have to give them any special access. They're going to have all of that available to them in the breakout rooms. And then activity 8, as we have it here, the lecturer can sum up what's happening, or sum up the session, look at what's happening next and how to continue on the conversation using the Canvas LMS. So again, I think the key thing here is not to just think of any of these tools in isolation, to think of something like Zoom working with all of those other tools that you have available to you in that diagram. And that's the idea of using the live session to do something like what we've just set out there in that structure, but also thinking of all of those other things like discussions, like graded discussions, announcements to maybe announce what's happening in the class, announce a Zoom session, rubrics, which we'll talk about there in a moment as well, in the context of a presentation, assessments and quizzes. Everything here works together really, which is the key thing, and nothing really in isolation. I think the most effective route forward is to think of choosing the tools here that suit your scenario of sort of running your own module and teaching your module, and they work really well in tandem with each other. So as we know, Zoom integrates really tightly with Canvas, and then Canvas obviously has all of those other features in there. So that is sort of a sample structure with a formative assessment, or number of formative assessment activities. You think about it, you have that polling session, you have reflection on your poll answers, and then you have the breakout rooms and the presentations. Another thing to think about, and I mentioned it already, is the idea of third-party applications. And this is the idea of sharing and collaborating with a third-party application. So examples of this might be what I set out a minute ago, like I'm just going to change that typo there. I suppose using something like Google Docs, collaborative document sharing, but also things like Kahoot, which is almost like it's an assessment platform in itself. I mean, if you think about it, when we were looking at the physical classroom, Kahoot would have been used maybe a lot by staff, where students were given the link to a Kahoot session, asked a number of questions, and people could answer on their phones. If you think about it, the online environment really lends itself even more so to something like a Kahoot session. So you could share a Kahoot session from Zoom, so the students can clearly see how the stuff is being answered, what the time frame is, etc. And they're getting it on their own end as well. They can obviously link in with that Kahoot outside of Zoom, answer the question, come back into Zoom then and see how everyone's answered, and how the lecture is running that. Also, things like digital whiteboarding tools. So while Zoom provides you with digital whiteboarding, mainly from a host point of view, like a lecture giving something via a whiteboard, there's also the idea of, other third-party whiteboarding tools that allow many people to contribute on a whiteboard at the same time, and then outside of the live sessions as well. So examples would be things like Miro, or Microsoft have an offering as well for whiteboarding, and that's just a whiteboarding scenario. You have many other options as well for other third-party applications, and I suppose again the key here to think of, or to note, is that you can use these tools as shares from Zoom, and then the conversation can carry on outside of Zoom into continuing on where you left off, basically. So there are some examples of sort of formative assessment activities. And to be fair, some of them kind of cross into the border of summative as well. I'm going to look at some summative assessment examples now before we finish up. And they're primarily the idea of presentation. So if you think about presentation and you think about what Zoom can provide us with, as we know, it provides us with a way of capturing what's happening live on screen, to be able to use our microphones, to be able to use our webcams, and for that to be recorded also. From our point of view, if we're running, presentations that are assessed, they're actually formal assessments, and they're given a grade. Zoom is really, really suitable for that, because if you think about it, you have all of your enrollments in your class. You can set up sort of scheduling so that you can book in slots for your students to do their presentations via Zoom. When they do their presentations, they can be timed, they can be recorded, and you can also review them afterwards to give further feedback. I want to talk about some maybe power tips as to what, in using presentations. So if we think about it, maybe in a scenario, let's say we have 20 students, we could give them time slots of something like maybe 8 minutes or to 10 minutes each, and really tightly manage that through the Canvas scheduler, which I think Roisin covered actually there last week in the Canvas sessions. But what we can do is we can set those up, and by virtue of the setup in CIT, we have the waiting room, so we can only allow the people into the session at their allotted time. So we have complete control over that. The student can do their share, provided we give them the correct permissions, and then the student can share their screen, use their webcam, use their microphone, and you can record them. Some tips with regard to that, I think the real big one really is a detailed brief, insofar as much detail as you can, provide them with detail on what they're meant to do. So if a student is to do a presentation on facilitating group work or something like that, that you give it as much detail in a one-pager brief as possible, including things like the time, the duration of the assignment, and maybe a rubric if you have it. If you don't, you can use the rubric to assess it for your own purposes, which is really, really useful when you're looking at presentations and you're trying to provide quick feedback, and then maybe afterwards do a kind of a second pass and provide more detailed feedback. So a detailed brief is really useful from a student's point of view. That can be hosted on Canvas, and give those key details, including the usual stuff like your marks and the duration, what they're meant to cover. And then the scheduler, as I say, Roisin covered this last week. If you want to check out that recording, the scheduler is really, really powerful, because that allows you to create time slots in your module, in your calendar. And almost, if you're familiar with Doodle, it's kind of a similar function, really. You allow the students to book into their slots. You provide enough slots, obviously, for your students to be able to book their presentation time. And then you just schedule one Zoom class through Canvas as you normally would. And you let the students in depending on who's scheduled for what time. All the students will know from their calendar exactly when they're meant to come online. And a good thing to do when you're running a presentation beforehand is just to make sure your students do a quick test of Zoom and are not kind of fumbling around using the microphone and so on, or to share. So you can provide the test Zoom link for that, or you could do a previous session where you'd kind of just do a quick test with students, almost like a clinic. Defining the specific duration is important, obviously, and we found that in doing a lot of the online programs that, there's a kind of a sweet spot between 8 minutes and 10 minutes for presentations. Anything longer, maybe you're creating obviously a bit more work for yourself in terms of the assessing, but the student often will get their point across depending on what the subject is in that 8 to 10 minute period. It allows you then as well to have a small rollover period in between each of the presentations to prepare for the next person, basically prepare for the next student. Using a timer is really important, so you can use your own phone, just a timer on your Android or your Apple phone. Also, there's a Google timer. If you could just go to Google and search for timer, there's a Google timer. So that's a browser-based timer that you can use. And I think it's always safe as well just to ask the student to time themselves. So that's something I've been doing laterally, is just saying to the student beforehand, just have your phone on hand, or your stopwatch if you have one, and set the timer for the duration that we've set in the brief, and work from that. And that way they're going to get an alert in their own background, usually kind of a ringer or something like that, and that just gives them the heads up without you having to intercede and to interrupt their presentation, and they'll know that they have to wrap up the presentation and so on. I think if you can use a rubric, it's really, really powerful tool as well when assessing presentations in particular, because, as I say, it allows you to do a really, a pass of the presentation as it's happening, to kind of highlight where you think the student lies in terms of the achievement bands. And then you can obviously use that as an indicator in, providing further feedback and reviewing the recording afterwards to provide them with as much feedback as you want to, really. But the rubric, and I just show you an example of maybe a sample presentation rubric. This type of thing, if you're looking at a presentation that's 8 to 10 minutes long of a student, and you have this on another screen, or you have it on your laptop or your phone, or if you have it printed out, this is really useful to just, even as the presentation goes on, say, okay, the student, I think, lies within this achievement band. This descriptor accurately reflects, where they lie in terms of the work that they've done in this presentation. And then afterwards, you can come back and you can review the rubric. You can adjust it if necessary, depending on, the reviewing of the recording. And, if you set it up in a spreadsheet, you can, automatically calculate up the grade for yourself, and then sanity check that against the work that was submitted. So I suppose the other thing is, sometimes, your presentation is only going to be part of the assessment, might be part of a summative assessment, or a larger summative task. In which case, that's perfectly fine. You're just going to, log the mark here, and then you're going to take on the submission maybe via Canvas, which is the practical work or something like that, and they both contribute then to a grade that you've set up, or a set of grades in Canvas, weighted assignments, for example. So that's a rubric example. I suppose just in terms of more power tips, we think about maybe considering the value of peer learning. So this is the idea of inviting other students, and you don't have to do this, but this is really useful, I think, in inviting students to learn from the process of the other students. Obviously, you'll get that by the virtue of the sessions being recorded. If you do that through Canvas, each of those sessions will actually be available for students to review. But I think it's often a nice idea to ask maybe, each student to come and view at least 2 to 3 of their peers' presentations. And I think that just has a really effective, it has an effect really in terms of, what the students kind of see of the module and the work that's happening. And there is definitely peer learning involved. Recording the session obviously is really important when you're recording it for assessment purposes. What you can do in Zoom is you can stop after each recording. And when you do that, if student 1 comes in through the waiting room, you record them for their 8 or 10 minute segment or whatever it is. You stop the recording, then that recording is actually logged with the session. And then you can begin the recording for the next student, stop it again, begin the recording for the next student. And that way you get multiple recordings. You can identify each of those recordings with the relevant student, and you can link to those if there's a need to in terms of maybe an external examiner or anything like that later on. So that's really, really powerful. And it also is, useful from your own point of view in terms of navigating through those assessments later on, or those presentations, and sanity checking any of the feedback or anything like that you've provided. Obviously, the waiting room is a default feature, and by using the waiting room in this context, I just mean letting people in that are meant to be in for the presentation. So obviously, if you've used the scheduler in this step, you'll know who's scheduled for a particular slot, and you're actually going to then leave them from the waiting room. So that's one of the main features of the waiting room. Another thing, I suppose, is to take notes through the session yourself. If you're using the rubric, that's a really good first pass. And obviously, alongside the rubric, you could be adding, presentation notes about the presentation, about the work that the student has done. And then, as I say, you can review the recording and the transcript afterwards. The transcript, again, is really useful because it does a live transcription of the presentation, so you can search through the recording transcript. That's a really nice feature as well in Zoom. So I think that's it. I think I've just gone a minute over time in the session, but I just want to maybe talk to you as we would normally about supports available. In any instance, really, if you're looking for technical advice or a breakdown of functions in Zoom, support.zoom.us, and going into the users and participants area will get you help on pretty much anything I've talked about here. Also, from our own point of view, if it's Canvas related, use the Canvas Tier 1 support that's available. But if it is Zoom related, either use the Zoom support.zoom.us function here, our link, or get onto us in our help desk, and our help desk solution will allow us to kind of queue up and triage anything coming in, and to answer them promptly as well as possible. We have a help desk as well, which has always been contributed to. So you'll see that in tel.cit.ie, go into the staff help articles, and there's a whole area here on Zoom. Again, that's actively being added to. And if there's anything that you think should be in there, please let us know if you don't mind. And I think that's it for today. I'm not sure if there's any questions there, Roisin. I'm just going to have a quick look over on Zoom and YouTube. I don't see anything in there yet. We might just leave it for a minute or so. So any questions, please feel free to throw them into the Q&A. And thanks, Roisin, for answering any of those questions so far. I'm just going to take a breath there. Okay, so nothing in so far, so we might wrap it up there, folks. Thanks a million for everyone who's watching either on YouTube or on Zoom. This session is recorded, so it'll be available on Zoom shortly after the session, on YouTube rather, and then we will also be running kind of duplicates of these sessions tomorrow morning and afternoon. Also, I suppose, please do touch base with us afterwards at tell.team@cit.e if you have any specific questions. But hopefully, some of that stuff will have some use to you in terms of running formative versus summative activities using Zoom. So thanks a million. Talk to you soon. Take care.